In this video, I'm going to show you how I made these racks to help me store my kayaks in my garage. Here is the basic design plan that I'm going to follow throughout this video. Each one of these pieces can be made from a single 2x4. Here is a complete list of materials and tools that I used to complete this project. My goal for this project is to store 2 kayaks, and so I actually need 4 of the rack pieces. If all you need to store is 1 kayak, you would just cut this materials list in half. There are a few optional steps that I go through in this video, and any materials and tools for those steps are marked with an asterisk. So let's get started. The first thing you're going to want to do is measure and cut each of those 2x4s. When I start working with a piece of lumber, I like to cut a little bit off of the end just because sometimes they're a little jaggedy, and I think that initial cut just sort of smooths things out for you a little bit. Then grab your tape measure and mark and cut each piece that you need. Here's 30 inches. And 20 inches, 18 inches, and finally 5 inches. One last thing to do is take care of the 45-degree angle cuts. Grab the 30-inch and the 18-inch boards and cut those ends at 45-degree angles. And then repeat this process as many times as you need. If you're storing 1 kayak, you would need to cut pieces out of 2 2x4s. If you're storing 2 kayaks, you'd need to cut pieces out of 4 2x4s. The next step I'm going to focus on is pre-drilling the holes for all the screws that I'm going to use to install the racks. I'm going to use 3-inch wood screws to anchor each piece to the wall. On the 30-inch piece, I decided I wanted to anchor screws into the wall at 10 inches and 20 inches. So I grabbed my tape measure and marked those spots. You'll also need to find the center of the board running widthwise. On a 2x4, that's at 1.75 inches or 1 3/4 inches. Then grab a drill with a bit that is smaller than the diameter of the screw that you're going to use and start drilling those spots that you marked. I also chose to sink the screws into each board a bit, just because I don't want to see the head of the screw flush with the board. This part is completely optional, but if you'd like to do it, here are a few things to keep in mind. Choose a drill bit that has a slightly larger diameter than the head of the screw that you're working with. You're also going to want to mark the drill bit so that you don't drill deeper than you intend to. I use painter's tape to help me do this. Now the thickness of a 2x4 is 1.5 inches, and I want to drill halfway into it. So I'm using a tape measure and the tape to mark 3/4 inches on the drill bit. If you choose not to sink your screws, I would also recommend that you use a 4-inch screw instead of a 3-inch screw, just to make sure that you get pretty far into the studs behind your wall. So that takes care of the 30-inch board. Next, I'm gonna drill into the 20-inch board so that I can connect the 5-inch board to it. First, I grabbed a scrap board and lined it up with where the 5-inch board would go and marked the space. I want 2 screws to fit across the width of this board, and so I grabbed my tape measure and marked the distances at 1 1/4 and 2 1/4 inches. Be sure to also find each marking center, which should be 3/4 inches into the board. And here is a close-up of the markings that I made. Then you're just going to repeat the same steps that you did on the 30-inch board. Grab your smaller drill bit and pre-drill those markings. And use the larger bit to drill sinkholes if you choose to do that. There's one more thing left to do with that 20-inch board. We're going to need to connect it to the 30-inch board, and I'm choosing to use kreg jig screws in order to do that. If you don't have a kreg jig screw kit, don't worry about it. You can accomplish this same goal without one. All you'd have to do is drill through the backside of the 30-inch board and then put a screw directly into that 20-inch board through the backside of that 30-inch board, and you'll be fine. I'd recommend using two 4-inch screws in order to do this. But I'm going to show you how I used my kreg jig in order to complete this task. Make sure that you consult your owner's manual so that you have the correct settings for a 2x4. You're going to use the 1.5-inch settings for both the stop collar on the bit and the riser on the kreg jig. Once you have everything all set up, get to work drilling those holes. This next step is completely optional. Whenever I'm working with 2x4s or just kind of pieces of raw lumber, I like to sand them down and clean them up a little bit. I usually sand in a 2-part process. First, I'll take a really rough grit sandpaper and run it over the entire board, just smoothing out any imperfections that may be there. I take that same paper and make sure that I go over all the edges of the board too. Then I take a very fine grit sandpaper and repeat this process. Sand over all the surfaces of the board, getting those edges as well. Be sure to repeat this process on all the boards that you're working with. This next step is again completely optional. If you want to jazz up your kayak storage system a little bit, consider putting a stain onto your wood pieces. I'm using a provincial wood stain. It matches some of the other projects I've completed for my garage already. I'm applying the stain to all of the wood surfaces, allowing it to dry, and then flipping those boards over and staining the other side too. When the boards are completely stained and dry, the last thing I'll do is apply a sealer. I use a polyurethane sealer in a warm satin finish, again just to match some of the other projects I've already done in my garage. And finally, we are on to the last step of this project, installation. First things first, grab your stud finder and use it to locate a stud behind your wall. Make sure you check from both the left and the right sides and use a pencil to mark the location of the stud. Next, grab the 30-inch board, center it on your markings for the wall stud, adjust it so that it's at the height that you want, and use a level to help you make sure that the board is completely vertical. Then when you're ready, grab your drill and screw those screws into place. Next, I'm going to work on screwing the 20-inch board about halfway up the 30-inch board using my kreg drill bit. And now I'm going to focus on securing the 5-inch piece at the end of that 20-inch piece. I'm using two 3-inch screws to secure it in place. Now on to the 18-inch board that's set at a 45-degree angle as a support bar. I used a nail gun to help me complete this step, but I want to say that if you don't have one, please don't feel like you need one. You can certainly just use a hammer in order to get this job done. If you have someone available who's willing to hold the board in place for you, it'll make this job a lot easier. Another thing that'll make it easier too is to pre-drill the nail holes. And then just grab a hammer and hammer in those 2-inch finishing nails. And now you just need to repeat this entire installation process on the second piece so that you have a complete rack to put the kayak on. Start with your stud finder and find another wall stud to anchor the piece into. Before you screw the 30-inch piece into the wall, you're going to want to use a level and make sure that it's not only vertical, but also that it's level with the other piece that you already installed. Make any adjustments that you need to, and then screw it in. Finish installing the other boards. And then here's a look at my final product. If you found this video helpful, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel.